Power isn't a force to be discovered, it's a thing to be made. In the shadowed history of the 20th century, where superpowers raced for the atom bomb and the moon, one man looked inward, searching for a weapon not in the elements of the earth, but in the fragile, untapped wiring of the human mind. His name was Dr. Martin Brenner, but his children, the ones he created and the ones he broke, would come to know him by a single, chilling name: Papa. But before we step into the sterile, blood-stained halls of Hawkins National Laboratory, we have to know, when it comes to Stranger Things, which season is your absolute favorite? Drop it in the comments below. Okay, with that settled, let's go back to the beginning, to a time before the monsters had names. The story of Martin Brenner doesn't begin with a gate to another dimension, but in the quiet, sterile lecture halls of academia. Born into an era of unprecedented scientific advancement and crippling global paranoia, Brenner was a product of his time. He was a prodigy, a brilliant mind who saw the world not as a place of people and emotions, but as a series of systems to be understood, manipulated, and ultimately controlled. His early career was marked by a relentless ambition, a disdain for the ethical hand-wringing of his peers, and an obsession with the fringes of human potential. While others were content to map the known world, Brenner wanted to chart the unknown continents of the mind. This ambition led him directly into the orbit of the CIA and their most clandestine, most controversial project, MKUltra. In the post-war haze of the 1950s, the United States was locked in a Cold War of ideologies with the Soviet Union, and the front lines of this war were not just in proxy states and nuclear silos, but in the realm of psychological warfare. The agency was desperate for an edge, exploring everything from hypnosis to truth serums, but their most fervent hope lay in the rumored field of psychokinesis and extrasensory perception. They believed the Soviets were already developing psychic soldiers, and they needed to not only catch up, but surpass them. For the CIA, it was a matter of national security. For Dr. Brenner, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He was given a blank check, a clandestine authority that superseded traditional oversight, and a mandate to unlock the secrets of the mind by any means necessary. He became a key figure in Project Indigo, a sub-project of MKUltra, which sought to identify and cultivate psychic abilities in knowing and unknowing subjects. His early experiments were a grim portfolio of human suffering. He administered hallucinogens, practiced sensory deprivation, and employed brutal psychological conditioning on a host of subjects: prisoners, conscientious objectors, and eventually willing volunteers drawn in by the promise of expanding their consciousness. One such volunteer was a young college student named Terry Ives. Brenner's initial work yielded frustratingly inconsistent results. He could induce hallucinations, break a person's will, but he couldn't consistently manifest the kind of raw power he dreamed of. He theorized that the adult mind was too rigid, too formed. The slate needed to be blank. The vessel needed to be pure. He needed to start from the beginning. His research began to shift, focusing on the effects of psychotropic drugs on pregnant women, postulating that the compounds could potentially unlock latent psychic abilities in the developing fetus. It was a monstrous, unethical leap of logic, but for Brenner, ethics were merely obstacles on the path to discovery. He saw human beings as variables in a grand equation, and he was the only one who had the courage to solve it. This was the foundational philosophy of the man who would become Papa, a chilling blend of patriotic fervor, scientific genius, and a profound, godlike narcissism. He believed he was molding the future, creating a new kind of human weapon to protect his country, but in reality he was laying the groundwork for a nightmare of his own design, one that would eventually consume him and everyone he touched. He was not just a scientist, he was an architect of monsters, and he was just getting started. The turning point for Dr. Brenner, the moment his theoretical research lurched into terrifying reality, arrived with the convergence of two critical factors: a promising subject and an unexpected development. The subject was Terry Ives, a young woman who had joined his MK trials at Hawkins National Laboratory. She was resilient, determined, and possessed a flicker of what Brenner believed was latent psychic potential. But the development was far more significant. Terry was pregnant. For Brenner, this was not a complication. It was the variable he had been searching for. It was the ultimate opportunity to test his most radical hypothesis, that psychic power could be cultivated in the womb, nurtured by a cocktail of hallucinogens and psychic stimuli, and brought to term in a subject whose mind was a truly blank slate. He saw Terry not as an expectant mother, but as an incubator for the world's first superweapon. The project, and Terry's participation, shifted in focus. Under the guise of continued consciousness-expanding experiments, Brenner began administering a carefully calibrated regimen of drugs, including LSD, to Terry throughout her pregnancy. He subjected her to sensory deprivation and constant psychic probing, all aimed at the developing mind of her unborn child. He meticulously documented every detail, every flutter of brain activity, every anomaly. Terry, unaware of the true nature of the experiment, believed she was contributing to a noble cause, pushing the boundaries of human experience. She was told the side effects, the strange visions and feelings of connection were part of the process. She had no idea that she was merely the vessel, and her daughter, Jane, was the true experiment. The birth was shrouded in secrecy. Brenner and his team orchestrated the delivery, and immediately after they covered their tracks with ruthless efficiency. Terry was told her daughter was stillborn, a tragic result of a difficult pregnancy. They produced a falsified death certificate, erased hospital records, and silenced anyone who might have known the truth. It was a clean, clinical, and monstrously cruel deception. In Brenner's mind, it was a necessary act. He believed Terry, or any biological parent, would be an impediment. Love, attachment, morality, these were contaminants to the pure, controlled environment he needed to create. He had to be the child's sole influence, her creator, her guide, her papa. He spirited the infant away to the deepest, most secure levels of Hawkins' lab, assigning her the designation that would define her existence. 0111. 11. The theft of Jane Ives was the true inciting incident of the entire Stranger Things saga. It was the original sin from which all subsequent horrors would spring. It was an act of profound hubris, a scientist playing God, severing the most fundamental human bond for the sake of his ambition. The immediate aftermath was defined by Brenner's consolidation of power and the tragic, desperate fight of a mother who refused to believe her child was gone. While Brenner began the first phase of Eleven's education in the sterile confines of the lab, Terry Ives began to unravel. She instinctively knew her daughter was alive. She was plagued by visions, a psychic echo of the connection Brenner himself had tried to foster. She started asking questions, pushing back against the official story. She accused Brenner of stealing her child, a claim the world saw as the ravings of a grief-stricken, mentally unstable woman whose mind had been shattered by drugs. Her fight became Brenner's first major conflict outside the lab. He couldn't allow her to expose him. He used his influence to discredit her, painting her as a conspiracy theorist. But Terry was relentless. She got a lawyer, she tried to sue, she even attempted to storm the lab with a gun. Each attempt was met with Brenner's cold, calculated response. Finally, to silence her for good, he resorted to the most brutal tool in his arsenal. He had Terry forcibly institutionalized and subjected her to high-voltage electroshock therapy, a procedure designed not to heal, but to destroy. It scrambled her mind, trapping her in a catatonic state, lost in an endless loop of her trauma, the birth, the theft, the search. She was silenced, but the psychic ember of her maternal rage remained. a ghost in the machine that would one day find its way back to her daughter. With Terry neutralized, Brenner had his victory. He had his subject, his lab, his secrecy. He had successfully stolen a child and erased her mother, creating the perfect blank slate. The first major conflict was over, and Brenner had won. But in doing so, he had planted the seeds of his own destruction, creating a legacy of pain and rage that would one day ripple outward, tearing a hole in the fabric of reality itself. With 11 secured and her mother neutralized, Dr. Brenner could finally build his kingdom. Hawkins National Laboratory transformed from a mere research facility into a fortress of secrecy, a personal fiefdom where Brenner's word was law and his will was absolute. He was no longer just a researcher under the umbrella of the CIA. He was the master of his own domain, the papa, to a growing family of broken, powerful children. This period marked the true rise of Brenner's faction, the dedicated, morally compromised, and utterly loyal staff of the HNL's Psychic Research Division. He handpicked his team, selecting scientists, doctors, and orderlies who shared his ambition and his willingness to operate in the ethical gray zones. They were drawn to his brilliance, his charisma, and the immense government funding he commanded. He fostered an environment of extreme compartmentalization and unwavering loyalty. They were told they were patriots, pioneers on the front line of the Cold War, and that the children in their care were not prisoners, but volunteers for a cause of monumental importance. Doubts were suppressed, and questions were discouraged. The heart of this new empire was the Rainbow Room. It was designed to look like a place of learning and play, with its colorful mural and circle of chairs. But this cheerful facade masked a grim reality. It was a classroom, a laboratory, and a prison. Here, Brenner began to assemble his collection of psychic subjects. While 11 was his most promising, she was not his only one. Through Project Indigo, he located other children who displayed flickers of latent ability, often acquiring them through dubious means, convincing or coercing parents to give them up for specialized education. Each child was stripped of their name and given a number tattooed on their wrist, 002, 06, 008, and so on. They became his test subjects, his children. The regime inside the lab was one of strict, methodical control. Brenner's approach was a twisted form of parenting. He could be kind, encouraging, and paternal, offering praise and rewards like a gumball or a round of applause for a successful display of power. He called them his children and insisted they call him Papa. This created a powerful psychological bond, a form of Stockholm Syndrome, where the children looked to their captor for love and validation. He was the sole source of their reality, the arbiter of right and wrong, good and bad. But this kindness was conditional. Failure was met with punishment, not with a simple scolding, but with isolation, public shaming in front of the other children, or confinement in dark, enclosed spaces. His most feared disciplinary tool was a small, windowless isolation chamber. This duality was the key to his control. By positioning himself as both a loving father and a terrifying disciplinarian, he kept the children in a state of perpetual dependency and fear. They craved his approval and dreaded his disappointment. His methods were designed to systematically break down their individual identities and remold them into extensions of his own will. He wasn't raising children, he was forging weapons. The experiments grew in intensity. He pushed them to crush soda cans with their minds, to listen in on conversations in other rooms, and eventually to remote view targets across the globe, a practice he called diving. He wanted spies who couldn't be caught, assassins who could kill from 1,000 miles away. The psychological toll on the children was immense. They were isolated from the outside world, from normal human contact, and from each other in any meaningful way. Their only purpose was to perform for Papa, to push their abilities to their breaking point, often resulting in nosebleeds, exhaustion, and intense psychological trauma. The Rainbow Room was a pressure cooker, and Brenner was methodically turning up the heat, completely oblivious to the fact that the most volatile element in his entire experiment was not one of the children he had raised, but a man he believed he had tamed. The carefully constructed world of the Rainbow Room was a system of control, but it was a fragile one, built on a foundation of lies and sustained by fear. The first major conflict to erupt from within this system didn't come from a rebellion of his numbered children, but from the specter of his greatest failure and his most audacious success, the birth of 11 and the suppression of her mother, Terry Ives. While Brenner saw the neutralization of Terry as a closed chapter, a necessary and successful maneuver to secure his prize subject, it was, in fact, an open wound. The psychic connection he had inadvertently fostered between mother and child during the pregnancy experiments did not simply vanish. It lingered as a faint, ghostly signal in the background noise of Eleven's developing consciousness. As 11 grew within the lab, her training intensified. Brenner pushed her harder than any of the other children. He saw in her a purity of power, an immense, raw potential that dwarfed the others. He subjected her to increasingly difficult tasks, demanding more and more of her abilities. The goal was no longer just crushing a soda can, it was far more ambitious. He wanted her to engage in psychic espionage, to remote view, or dive into the minds of Soviet agents and listen to their secrets. To achieve this, he used the sensory deprivation tank, a tool that would become central to her story. Submerged in the saltwater darkness, Eleven's mind could travel, unmoored from her physical body. It was during one of these early, forced dives that the first major conflict began to brew. Pushing her to find a specific target, Brenner forced her deeper into the psychic void than ever before. And in that black, featureless space, she found something else. It wasn't human. It was a creature, tall and gaunt, with a head that peeled back like a horrifying flower. The Demogorgon. This was the first contact. For Brenner, this was an astonishing, unprecedented breakthrough. He had not only proven the existence of psychic espionage, but had stumbled upon another dimension, another plane of existence. The scientist in him was electrified by the discovery. The patriot in him saw its potential as the ultimate weapon. If he could not only listen to his enemies, but potentially unleash this creature upon them, the Cold War would be over. His ambition, already monumental, now became cosmic in scale. However, his obsession blinded him to the immense danger. He failed to see the terror in Eleven's eyes, the sheer primal fear of a child who had touched a monster in the dark. He dismissed her pleas and forced her back into the tank, demanding she make contact again. This was his critical error. He treated the Demogorgon as a specimen to be observed, not a predator to be feared. The conflict was now twofold: Brenner's scientific ambition versus Eleven's terrified refusal. He pushed, she resisted. In a final, desperate experiment, he amplified the psychic energy, forcing 11 to bridge the gap between her mind and the creature's reality. And in that moment, under the immense strain of her power and fear, something broke. She didn't just touch the monster, she opened a door for it. A psychic rupture, a tear in the fabric of space-time, formed deep within the lab. The gate. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The lights in the lab flickered and died. A wet, organic wound appeared on the wall of the sub-basement, a pulsating gateway to the upside down. The Demogorgon was no longer a distant vision. It was a physical threat. In the ensuing panic and confusion, as alarms blared and scientists scrambled, the source of the catastrophe, 11, saw her chance. Terrified of the monster she had unleashed and the man who had forced her to do it, she fled. She used her powers to escape the lab, disappearing into the woods of Hawkins, Indiana. Brenner was left with the disastrous consequences of his hubris. His most powerful subject was gone. A monster from another dimension was loose in his facility. and a permanent bleeding wound to another world was festering in his basement. The first major conflict born from his theft of a child had culminated in an event that threatened to destroy not just his project, but the world itself. He had won the initial battle against Terry Ives, but in doing so, he had started a war he was not prepared for. The escape of 11 and the opening of the gate marked the beginning of a new, desperate phase for Dr. Brenner. His controlled, sterile world had been shattered, and he was now in a frantic race against time. This was his lost era, not in the sense of time past, but in the loss of control, the loss of his prize asset, and the loss of secrecy. The primary objective shifted from research to damage control and retrieval. His first priority was to contain the situation within Hawkins' lab. The Demogorgon, now free to roam the lower levels, began picking off his staff one by one. The lab transformed from a place of science to a hunting ground. Brenner, ever the cold pragmatist, sacrificed his own people to understand the creature. He sent teams in, armed and armored, not necessarily to kill the beast, but to study it, to learn its weaknesses, its behaviors. Every death was a data point. Simultaneously, he initiated a massive clandestine search for 11. He knew she was the key to understanding and perhaps closing the gate. She was also a massive liability. A child with her powers, traumatized and frightened, was a loose cannon in the civilian world. His teams, posing as government agents from the Department of Energy, swarmed the town of Hawkins, setting up roadblocks, tapping phone lines, and intimidating locals. They were a shadowy, menacing presence, operating with an authority that superseded local law enforcement. This rebuilding phase was about re-establishing his crumbling empire. He had to project an aura of absolute control to the outside world while internally grappling with a crisis of unprecedented scale. His public-facing persona was calm and authoritative, as seen when he dealt with Hawkins' police chief Jim Hopper. He spun a web of lies about missing children, power outages, and scientific experiments gone awry, all to conceal the grotesque truth festering beneath the town. He was a master of manipulation, using partial truths and bureaucratic doublespeak to keep people like Hopper and Joyce Byers at bay. While his agents scoured the woods for 11, Brenner's scientific teams worked feverishly to study the gate. It was the scientific discovery of a millennium, a doorway to an entirely new ecosystem. They sent probes through, collected atmospheric samples, and even sent a tethered volunteer into the Upside Down, a disastrous mission that only confirmed the sheer hostility of the other side. Brenner was caught between his terror of the unknown and his insatiable curiosity. He needed to close the gate to prevent further incursions, but the scientist in him couldn't resist the urge to study it, to understand the power he had unleashed. The pressure was immense. The government, his shadowy benefactors, wanted answers. They saw the potential for a catastrophic breach of national security. Brenner had to manage their expectations, assuring them he had the situation under control, all while knowing that a monster was loose and his only hope of controlling it was a terrified little girl who now saw him as the enemy. The rebuilding was not just physical, but psychological. He had to reassert his authority over his remaining staff, many of whom were terrified and questioning his leadership. He did this through a combination of inspiration and intimidation, reminding them of their patriotic duty while subtly threatening them with the consequences of disloyalty. His grip on power, once absolute, was now maintained through sheer force of will. This period was a high-wire act. Brenner was juggling a dimensional rift, a monster hunt, a public cover-up, and a search for his escaped weapon, all while trying to keep his entire operation from imploding. The lost era was defined by his desperation, his ruthlessness, and his unwavering belief that he, and only he, could fix the mess he had created. He just needed to get his daughter back. While Brenner grappled with the immediate crisis of the Demogorgon and the open gate, The true threat, the one that dwarfed the singular monster hunting in Hawkins, was an entity he had created and long thought vanquished. The re-emergence of this new threat was not a sudden event, but a slow, creeping realization that the horrors of the Upside Down were not random, but intelligent and coordinated. The entity that would come to be known as the Mind Flayer was the true master of the Upside Down, and its presence began to be felt long before it was seen. Chronologically, this threat had been born years earlier in the Hawkins lab massacre, when Eleven, manipulated by a young orderly named Peter Ballard, removed the inhibitor chip from his neck. She unleashed the full power of Henry Creel, Subject 001. In their psychic duel, she did not kill him, she blasted him into the nascent, chaotic dimension of the Upside Down. There, scarred by her power and burned by interdimensional lightning, Henry did not just survive, he evolved. He found a world of primordial, unformed matter, a hive mind of raw potential. Using his immense psychic abilities, he began to shape it, to give it form and purpose. He became its consciousness, its will. He sculpted the swirling, chaotic particles into a monstrous, spider-like form, a reflection of his own obsession with black widows. He became Vecna, and the particles he controlled became the Mind Flayer. This was the new threat, re-emerging from the ashes of Brenner's first great failure. The Demogorgon that escaped through the gate was not a lone predator. It was a scout, a single hound sent forth from a vast, intelligent pack commanded by a vengeful general. Brenner, in his initial dealings with the Upside Down in 1983, likely did not understand this. He saw the dimension as a hostile but feral ecosystem. The idea of a controlling intelligence, let alone one he had personally created, was beyond his comprehension at the time. His focus was singular. Find 11, kill the Demogorgon, close the gate. The re-emergence of the Mind Flayer as a concept, an idea, truly began after Brenner's apparent death at the hands of the Demogorgon in Hawkins Middle School. In the year that followed, Will Byers, who had been trapped in the Upside Down, began to exhibit a terrifying connection to the other side. He had visions of a colossal shadow monster looming over a red-skied Hawkins. This was the Mind Flayer beginning to probe, to extend its influence back into the human world through the foothold Will's presence had provided. Had Brenner been active at this time, he would have been the first to recognize the signs of a psychic link, a form of possession. He would have seen the patterns, but in his absence, it fell to others to piece together the terrifying truth. The new threat was an idea that slowly dawned on the heroes of Hawkins. They were not fighting individual monsters, but an army. The Demodogs that emerged in Season 2 were not a new species, but another tool of the same entity, all connected to the hive mind. This shift from a singular creature-feature threat to an intelligent invading force represented a massive escalation. It was the re-emergence of Vecna's will, acting through the proxy of the Mind Flayer. For Brenner's story, this is a posthumous revelation of his greatest folly. He thought the danger was a monster he let out of a cage. The reality was that the danger was a monster he threw into a dimension of raw power, giving it the tools to become a god. The new threat wasn't something that crawled out of the Upside Down, it was the Upside Down itself, given consciousness and a burning hatred for the girl who banished it there, and by extension, the man who started it all. The Order, Dr. Brenner had painstakingly built at Hawkins' lab, was shattered by the events of November 1983. However, the legacy of that order and the internal conflicts it bred continued to ripple outward, defining the very nature of the war against the Upside Down. After Brenner's apparent death, the Department of Energy and the US government scrambled to fill the power vacuum. They brought in a new face, Dr. Sam Owens, to take over operations at Hawkins' lab. Owens represented a new order in how the government approached the supernatural crisis. Where Brenner was a radical, a zealot driven by ambition and a god complex, Owens was a pragmatist, a bureaucrat, His primary goal was not to weaponize the Upside Down, but to contain it, to study it cautiously, and above all, to keep it secret. He was more concerned with cauterizing the wound than dissecting it. This new order was immediately beset by internal conflicts. The first was the philosophical clash between Brenner's methods and Owens's approach. The remnants of Brenner's staff who remained at the lab were indoctrinated in his aggressive, high-risk methodology. They saw the gate as an opportunity, a resource. Owens saw it as a time bomb. This created tension within the lab, a struggle between the old guard who revered Papa and the new administration that viewed him as a reckless cowboy whose actions had led to disaster. The second, more profound internal conflict was the one raging inside 11. She was now living in secret with Jim Hopper, attempting to have a normal life. But she was a product of Brenner's system, a child soldier trying to adapt to a world of Eggo waffles and television. The conflict was between her desire for normalcy and the identity that had been forced upon her. She was haunted by Brenner, by the Rainbow Room, by the other numbered children. This led her on a journey to find her sister, Kali Prasad, number 008. The discovery of Kali and her gang of outcasts revealed a schism in the legacy of Brenner's program. While 11's powers were primarily telekinetic, Kali's were illusionary, demonstrating the variety in Brenner's experiments. More importantly, it showed a different path for his children. Kali had embraced her anger, using her powers for revenge against the people from Hawkins' lab who had wronged them. She tried to push 11 down this same path of rage and retribution. The internal conflict for 11 was immense. Should she follow Kali's path of vengeance, a path Brenner's cruelty had arguably justified? Or should she choose a path of protection, using her powers to save her friends? This was a battle for her soul, a direct consequence of the psychological conditioning and trauma inflicted by Brenner. Her ultimate rejection of Kali's violent crusade and her return to Hawkins was a rejection of the idea that his cruelty should define her. She chose to be a protector, not an assassin, a decision that placed her in direct opposition to Brenner's original intent for her. Meanwhile, back in Hawkins, the new order under Dr. Owens was failing. His attempts to contain the Upside Down through controlled burns of the burgeoning tunnel system only provoked the Mind Flayer, which used its connection to Will Byers to fight back. Owens, for all his pragmatism, was out of his depth. He lacked Brenner's intimate, albeit twisted, understanding of psychic power and interdimensional biology. He was a conventional scientist trying to solve an unconventional problem. The internal conflict of the new order was its inability to comprehend the sheer malice and intelligence of the force they were facing. They were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that operated on a psychic, hive mind level. Their failure culminated in the Demodog massacre at the lab, a brutal echo of the chaos from the previous year. The new order, like the old one, collapsed under the weight of the Upside Down's assault, proving that a change in leadership meant little when the fundamental problem, the gate, remained open. It was a problem that could only be solved by the one person who created it, the one person who represented Brenner's greatest success and his most profound failure, 11. In the long and brutal history of Dr. Brenner's project, one event stands as the single, pivotal turning point that redefined his work, his life, and the very nature of the threat facing the world: the Hawkins Lab massacre of 1979. This was not just a setback, it was a cataclysm that destroyed the original Rainbow Room program and directly created the primary antagonist of the entire saga, Vecna. Before this event, Brenner was at the apex of his power. He had a stable of psychic children, a loyal staff, and a system of control he believed was infallible. His primary focus was on cultivating their powers for espionage. The crown jewel of his program, he believed, was 11, but his day-to-day operations were managed by his staff, including a seemingly kind and helpful orderly. This orderly was, in fact, his first subject, Henry Creel, number 001. After murdering his family in the 1950s, a young Henry was taken in by a fascinated doctor, Brenner, who saw in him a raw, pre-existing power unlike anything he had ever encountered. Realizing he couldn't control the boy's malevolent nature, Brenner did the only thing he could. He suppressed it. He implanted a device in Henry's neck, the soteria, which dampened his psychic abilities and erased his memories, effectively turning his most powerful subject into a neutered janitor. He then used Henry's blood and genetic material to create the other children, hoping to replicate his power in more malleable, controllable forms. This was Brenner's ultimate act of hubris. He kept his greatest monster as a lamb among his flock, believing him to be tamed. The turning point began when the orderly, who now went by Peter Ballard, saw an opportunity in the small, lonely, and immensely powerful 11. He began to manipulate her, preying on her isolation and her fear of the other children who bullied her. He presented himself as a friend, a fellow prisoner in Papa's system. He told her that Brenner was a liar and a monster, and that together they could escape. He convinced her that the device in his neck was a tracker, and that if she used her powers to remove it, he would help her get away. In a moment of desperate trust, 11 agreed. She focused her telekinesis and ripped the soteria from his neck. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Henry Creel's full power and memories came rushing back. The meek orderly was gone, replaced by a being of pure rage and psychic energy. He unleashed his telekinetic fury upon the lab. Guards, doctors, and even the other numbered children were slaughtered in an instant. They were no match for his power. Bodies were contorted, bones snapped, and eyes were destroyed in a gruesome display of his signature cruelty. The Rainbow Room became a charnel house. Brenner, hearing the alarms and seeing the carnage on the security monitors, was confronted with the terrifying reality of his failure. The monster he thought he had caged was now loose and burning his kingdom to the ground. The critical turning point culminated in a psychic duel between the two most powerful products of Brenner's work. A terrified 11 covered in the blood of her fallen siblings stood against the monstrous, gloating Henry. He offered her a place at his side, a chance to use their power to cleanse the world of the broken human race. When she refused, he attacked. In the ensuing battle, fueled by a memory of her mother's love, a memory Brenner had tried so hard to erase, 11 tapped into a power she didn't know she possessed. She didn't just fight him, she overpowered him, pinning him to the wall and disintegrating his physical form, while simultaneously tearing open the first, temporary gate to the Upside Down. She didn't kill him. She banished him. This event was the crucible that forged the rest of the story. It transformed Henry Creel into Vecna. It left 11 deeply traumatized, her memories of the event suppressed by her own mind and by Brenner's subsequent efforts to bury the truth. And it fundamentally altered Brenner's mission. His project was in ruins, his children dead. All he had left was 11, the one who had both caused and stopped the catastrophe. From this moment on, his focus would become singular, controlling her, understanding the power she had unleashed, and preparing for the day her past would inevitably return. The Hawkins Lab massacre was the moment Dr. Brenner's meticulously constructed world came crashing down, and in its ashes he was irrevocably transformed. The fall of this key figure was not a simple defeat, but a complex metamorphosis from a confident controller into a haunted, desperate man. His transformation was forged in the crucible of his own creation's wrath. When the alarms first blared and the screams echoed through the lab, Brenner's initial reaction would have been one of controlled analysis. An experiment gone wrong? A subject losing control? He would have moved with clinical urgency, a commander facing a breach in protocol. But as he watched the security feeds, as he saw the telekinetic carnage wrought by the man he knew as a simple orderly, that clinical detachment would have shattered. The bloodless, floating bodies of his staff, and the mangled forms of his numbered children were not just a failure, they were an indictment. It was the complete and total annihilation of his life's work at the hands of the one variable he thought he had permanently solved. His confrontation with the newly reawakened Henry Creel was the ultimate fall from grace. For years, Brenner had been the papa, the omnipotent figure of authority. Now he stood powerless before his first son, who mocked his weakness and his failed attempts at control. Henry's monologue, his venomous diatribe against Brenner and humanity, was not just a villain's rant, it was a mirror held up to Brenner's own soul. It exposed the lie at the heart of his project. He claimed to be building saviors, but Henry argued he was just creating more sophisticated predators, just like him. Brenner likely survived the initial onslaught through sheer luck, or Henry's cruel desire to leave him alive to witness the failure. Perhaps Henry simply didn't see him as a threat worthy of a direct attack. Regardless, the psychological damage was immense. He saw the power he had sought to cultivate turned into an instrument of pure, nihilistic rage. And then he witnessed the impossible. He saw his youngest, most frightened subject, 11, stand against this godlike being and win. He saw her tap into a force of emotional, raw power that defied his scientific understanding and blast Henry into another dimension. This moment was both his salvation and his damnation. He was saved from certain death, but he was also confronted with a power he had not created, merely unlocked, and could not truly comprehend. In the aftermath, Brenner was a fallen king surveying a ruined kingdom. His project was destroyed, his investment of time and resources turned to literal dust and blood. He was faced with a monumental cover-up, needing to explain the deaths of dozens of personnel and all but one of his psychic children to his government overseers. This is where his transformation solidified. The ambitious, confident scientist was replaced by a man driven by two powerful, intertwined forces, fear and obsession. He was terrified of what Henry Creel had become in that other dimension. He knew on some level that he hadn't seen the last of him, and he became utterly obsessed with 11. She was no longer just his most promising subject. She was the only thing that had stood against his greatest failure. She was the weapon that could counter the one he had inadvertently created. His methods with her changed. The group setting of the Rainbow Room was gone. Her training became isolated, intense, and laser-focused on pushing the boundaries of the power she had displayed against Henry. He suppressed her memories of the massacre, likely through a combination of psychological manipulation and perhaps even drugs, convincing her that she was the monster, that she had killed everyone. This guilt became another chain, another tool of control. He needed her to be powerful, but he also needed her to be broken and dependent on him, terrified of her own potential. The fall of Dr. Brenner in 1979 was not his death, but the death of his original dream. He transformed from a creator into a custodian, a man desperately trying to control the only remaining piece of a shattered puzzle, all while dreading the day the piece he had thrown away would come back to reclaim the board. After the 1979 massacre, Dr. Brenner's world shrank to a single point of focus. 11. In the narrative of his own mind, she became the new protagonist of his story, the living embodiment of his last hope for redemption and control. Simultaneously, the memory of Henry Creel, now festering in the Upside Down, became the ultimate antagonist, a ghost that haunted every experiment and every decision Brenner made from that day forward. With the other children gone, Brenner poured all of the lab's resources into 11. Her life became a sterile, isolated loop of tests and training. The cheerful facade of the Rainbow Room was gone, replaced by the stark, clinical reality of her individual confinement. She was no longer part of a class. She was a singular, top-secret project. Brenner's relationship with her intensified, becoming even more psychologically complex. He was the only human contact she had, the source of all information, the one who defined her reality. He cultivated her dependence, positioning himself as the only person who understood her, the only one who could protect her from the monsters in the world, and the monster he convinced her she was. He framed her powers not as a gift, but as a dangerous flaw that only he could help her manage. This narrative was crucial for his control. By making her believe she was responsible for the massacre, he could use her guilt as a leash. Every nosebleed, every moment of exhaustion was framed as a consequence of her own dangerous nature, reinforcing her need for his guidance and his protection. The experiments were no longer about simple telekinesis. They were now geared towards honing her abilities for a specific purpose. He was training her to fight a psychic war, to be the countermeasure to the threat he knew was lurking in another dimension. The diving in the sensory deprivation tank became the primary tool. He pushed her to reach out with her mind, to search the void, ostensibly for Soviet spies, but perhaps also as a form of early warning system, a periscope into the darkness where he had banished his first son. This period of intense, isolated training shaped 11 into the person we meet at the beginning of Season 1. Immensely powerful, deeply traumatized, socially stunted, and with a vocabulary limited to the clinical, detached language of the lab. She was a finely tuned weapon who didn't know she was a weapon, a prisoner who believed her cage was a sanctuary. The antagonist, the spectral presence of Henry E001 Vecna, informed every action Brenner took. His desperation to control 11 was directly proportional to his fear of what Henry was becoming. He had seen firsthand what unrestrained psychic power coupled with pure malevolence could do. He couldn't risk 11 ever turning against him in the same way. This fear explains his ruthlessness, his willingness to emotionally manipulate a child. In his mind, the stakes were cosmic. The kind, paternal Papa persona was a carefully crafted tool to keep his protagonist loyal, while the harsh disciplinarian emerged whenever she pushed back, a reflection of his terror of losing control again. The introduction of these redefined roles, 11 as the unwitting hero of his dark narrative and Vecna as the unseen villain, set the stage for the next major conflict. Brenner, in his attempt to use his protagonist to spy on his nation's enemies, would inadvertently lead her to discover a different monster, the Demogorgon. In his obsession with preparing for the return of the old antagonist, he would stumble upon a new one and, in his hubris, fail to recognize that they were all just different faces of the same singular threat he had created years ago. The singular focus on 11 and the looming shadow of his past failure drove Dr. Brenner to push his subject to unprecedented limits. This relentless pressure culminated in the second major conflict of his career, a disaster with stakes that spiraled far beyond the walls of his lab, threatening the entire town of Hawkins and potentially the world. The conflict was born from the intersection of his two primary goals: using 11 as a tool for Cold War espionage and understanding the nature of the dimension he had briefly glimpsed when she banished Henry Creel. He became obsessed with the concept of remote viewing, believing that if 11 could be trained to psychically project her consciousness, she could become the ultimate spy, able to listen to any conversation anywhere in the world without leaving the safety of her tank. He saw this as the key to winning the Cold War and, perhaps more importantly, re-establishing his value to the government agencies that funded him. He needed a win, a tangible result to justify the catastrophe of 1979 and the immense resources he had since consumed. The experiments grew more and more intense. He would present 11 with a photograph of a target, a Soviet general, a foreign dignitary, and immerse her in the sensory deprivation tank, urging her to find them. In the black psychic void, a space he and 11 called the in-between, She could hone in on the bioelectric signature of a person and eavesdrop on their thoughts and words. For a time, it worked. He was gathering intelligence, proving his theories correct. But Brenner, ever the ambitious scientist, wasn't satisfied. He wanted to push further. He wanted to know the limits of this ability. What else was out there in the void? This curiosity, born from his encounter with the Upside Down during Henry's banishment, would be his undoing. During one of these deep dives, as he pushed 11 to listen to a Russian agent, she stumbled upon something else. It was not human. It was the Demogorgon, a creature native to the Upside Down, drawn to the psychic disturbance caused by 11's projection. Her first contact was terrifying. She saw the creature in the void, feasting on a strange, egg-like object. A lesser man, a more cautious scientist, would have pulled back, recognizing the immense danger of interacting with an unknown, hostile entity. But Brenner was not a cautious man. He was an obsessive one. He saw not a monster, but a discovery of unparalleled significance. The conflict escalated. A terrified 11 refused to go back, but Brenner was insistent. He saw this not as a threat, but as the ultimate test. He forced her back into the tank, demanding she make contact with the creature itself. He wanted to see it, to understand it. This was the point of no return. In the final, fateful experiment, under immense pressure from Brenner, 11's psychic projection did not just observe the Demogorgon, she touched it. This act of psychic contact, amplified by the equipment in the lab and the sheer power of 11's abilities, did more than just get the creature's attention. It tore a hole in the wall between worlds. A stable, physical gateway to the Upside Down ripped open in the sub-basement of Hawkins' lab. The broader stakes became immediately apparent. This wasn't a contained psychic event anymore. It was a physical invasion. The Demogorgon was no longer a ghost in the machine. It was a predator loose in the material world. The conflict had shifted from a psychological battle between Brenner and 11 to a physical war between dimensions. Brenner had achieved his goal of making a monumental discovery, but in his hubris, he had unleashed a nightmare. The second major conflict was the direct result of his inability to learn from his past mistakes. He had once again underestimated a power he could not control, and the consequence was not just the escape of his prized subject, but the breaching of reality itself. The opening of the gate was not a victory for Dr. Brenner. It was the beginning of his end. The immediate aftermath was a cascade of devastating losses, culminating in the complete shattering of his control and the sacrifice of everything he had built. The first and most critical loss was 11 herself. In the chaos that followed the gate's creation, as alarms blared and the Demogorgon began its hunt through the lab's lower levels, the terrified child at the center of the storm saw her opportunity. Faced with a monster she had unwillingly summoned and a papa who had forced her into that nightmare, she chose flight. Using her powers, she broke through the lab's security and escaped into the unfamiliar woods of Hawkins. For Brenner, this was a catastrophic failure. 11 wasn't just his most valuable asset. She was the only one with a direct connection to the new threat. She was the weapon and the key to understanding it. Without her, he was flying blind, left only with the terrifying consequences of his actions. His search for her became a frantic, desperate obsession, the central focus of his operations throughout the events of Season 1. The second devastating loss was the illusion of secrecy. For years, Brenner had operated in the shadows, his project shielded by layers of government classification and his own ruthless enforcement of silence. The escape of the Demogorgon and the subsequent disappearance of a local boy, Will Byers, blew that secrecy to pieces. Suddenly, his clandestine operation was at the center of a public crisis. He had to contend with a bulldog of a police chief in Jim Hopper and a fiercely determined mother in Joyce Byers, both of whom refused to accept the simplistic cover stories his agency provided. Every lie he told, every piece of evidence he planted, like the fake corpse of Will Byers, was a desperate attempt to patch a dam that was crumbling under the pressure of the truth. His world of absolute control was being invaded by the messy, unpredictable variables of the outside world. The ultimate sacrifice, however, was the lives of his own people and the sanctity of his facility. The Demogorgon was not a creature that could be easily contained or studied. It was an apex predator, and Hawkins' lab was its new hunting ground. Scientists, soldiers, and staff members, the very people who had been loyal cogs in his machine, became its victims. The sterile hallways of his scientific kingdom were stained with their blood. This culminated in the final confrontation at Hawkins Middle School. Luring the Demogorgon there in a last-ditch effort to recapture 11, Brenner and his team were outmaneuvered. The creature, drawn by the scent of blood from 11 and the boys, was far more savage and powerful than his soldiers had anticipated. In the final moments, as the Demogorgon launched itself at the children, Brenner was seen being tackled, seemingly mauled to death by the monster he had unleashed. In that moment, he was forced to make the ultimate sacrifice, not by choice, but by consequence. He and his men became a final, bloody barrier between the monster and the children. His death was the final, devastating loss. The master manipulator, the man who saw people as pawns, was reduced to a piece of meat, consumed by his own ambition. He lost his subject, his secrecy, his facility, his staff, and ultimately, his own life. The entire edifice of his power, built over decades of ruthless work, was sacrificed at the altar of a single, catastrophic mistake. He had opened a door to another world, and in the end, its horrors had come through and consumed him whole. The apparent death of Dr. Brenner at the hands of the Demogorgon sent shockwaves through the clandestine world he inhabited, but the true fallout was psychological and emotional, echoing most profoundly within the mind of his greatest creation, 11. For her, the death of her papa was not a simple moment of liberation, but a deeply complicated and traumatic event that would define her struggle for identity in the years to come. In the immediate aftermath, 11's primary emotion was likely relief mixed with terror. The man who had imprisoned and tortured her was gone, but his absence created a vacuum. For her entire life, Brenner had been the sun around which her small, dark world orbited. He was the source of pain, but also the source of praise, the one who gave her purpose, however twisted. To be suddenly free of that defining influence was to be utterly adrift. This emotional fallout fueled her actions in the year that followed. She was a ghost, hiding in the woods, and later in Hopper's cabin, grappling with a past she couldn't fully understand and a future she couldn't imagine. The psychological conditioning ran deep. She still saw herself through the lens Brenner had created, as a monster, a weapon, something dangerous that needed to be hidden away. Her journey to find her sister, Kaylee, was a direct result of this fallout. It was a search for connection, for someone else who could understand the unique trauma of the Rainbow Room. Kaylee represented a different path, one of anger and vengeance, a way to process the pain by inflicting it upon their tormentors. The most wanted board in Carly's hideout, filled with the faces of former HNL employees, was a tangible representation of the psychological poison Brenner had left behind. He had turned children into weapons, and now they were aiming themselves at his legacy. 11's ultimate rejection of Carly's path was a crucial moment in dealing with the fallout. She chose to save her friends rather than pursue revenge, a decision that represented her first major step away from the identity Brenner had tried to impose on her. She was choosing to define her own purpose. The psychological fallout also manifested in her suppressed memories. Brenner had so effectively manipulated her and buried the trauma of the 1979 massacre that she carried a heavy, misplaced guilt. This psychic wound festered, impacting her control over her powers and her sense of self-worth. It was a chain that kept her tethered to him, even in death. For the other characters, the fallout from Brenner's reign was just as significant. For Joyce Byers and Jim Hopper, he became the face of a vast, cruel government conspiracy. He represented the faceless evil that had stolen Will, that had lied to them, and that had treated their town and their children as collateral damage. Their fight against the subsequent threats from the Upside Down was fueled by the righteous anger born from their encounters with Brenner and his organization. They were no longer just fighting monsters, they were fighting against the kind of arrogant, dehumanizing power that Brenner embodied. The emotional and psychological fallout of Brenner's actions in Season 1 was the foundation for everything that came after. He had created a hero in 11, but a hero burdened with immense trauma. He had created determined enemies in Joyce and Hopper, and he had left behind a bleeding wound in reality, the Gate, which would continue to plague Hawkins. Even in his absence, his shadow loomed large, a constant reminder of the original sin that started it all. The world was, for a time, free of Dr. Brenner, but it was not free of his consequences. The echoes of his cruelty and ambition continued to shape the lives of everyone he had touched. Years after his presumed death in the hallways of Hawkins Middle School, the ghost of Dr. Martin Brenner returned, not as a spectre, but as a living man with one final, desperate plan. This period marked his final push, a last-ditch effort to prepare for the end he had foreseen since 1979. He had survived the Demogorgon attack, though not unscathed, and had gone deep underground, biding his time, watching from the shadows as the threat from the Upside Down evolved and escalated. His re-emergence was orchestrated in partnership with an unlikely ally, Dr. Sam Owens. Owens, who had tried and failed to contain the Upside Down through conventional means, was now a man humbled and disgraced. He had seen the failure of his own methods and the rise of a new, more aggressive military faction, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jack Sullivan, who believed 11 was the cause of Hawkins' problems, not the solution. Faced with the re-emergence of Vecna, the very monster Brenner had warned him about, Owens realized he was out of his depth. He needed the one man who understood the origin of the threat, Brenner. Together they formed a tense, uneasy alliance. They established a secret underground facility in the Nevada desert, a converted ICBM silo, and inside it they built Brenner's final gambit, the Nina Project. The purpose of Nina was singular and audacious, to restore 11's powers, which had been dormant since her battle with the Mind Flayer at Starcourt Mall. Brenner theorized that her powers weren't gone, but that a psychological block, a stroke of sorts caused by the immense exertion and trauma, was suppressing them. The Nina Project was his proposed cure. It was a specialized, highly advanced sensory deprivation tank designed to force a subject to relive suppressed memories, essentially a form of immersive, psychic, physical therapy. This was Brenner's ultimate preparation for the end. He knew that Vecna, his first son, was the true enemy. The Demogorgons, the Mind Flayer, they were all just puppets. He knew that only a power equal to Vecna's could stop him, and that power resided in 11. The entire Nina Project was built on this desperate hope. He had to remake his daughter one last time, not for espionage, but for a war to save the world. To achieve this, he had to bring 11 back into his fold. He intercepted her as she was being transported to a juvenile detention facility, using Owens's authority to whisk her away to their desert bunker. This was his final push, a calculated risk that required him to confront the very person he had wronged the most. The preparation phase within the Nina silo was a tense psychological battle. Brenner fell back into his old role of papa, using his calm, paternal tone to try and convince 11 that this was all for her own good, that he was the only one who could help her. He was a man possessed by his mission, seemingly blind to the profound pain he had caused. He saw her trauma not as a wound he had inflicted, but as an obstacle to be overcome. He forced her to relive her most painful memories, the bullying in the Rainbow Room, her isolation, and finally, the horrific truth of the 179 massacre. He was preparing her for her fight with Vecna by forcing her to confront the moment of his creation. It was a brutal, agonizing process, but it was his only remaining path. The final push was a race against time. While 11 was submerged in Nina, Vecna was continuing his killing spree in Hawkins. Brenner and Owens monitored the situation, knowing that every new death brought Vecna closer to his goal of tearing down the walls between worlds. The fate of everything rested on this one last, desperate experiment, a final attempt by a fallen scientist to undo the damage of his life's work by re-empowering the one child who had survived it. The sterile, subterranean confines of the Nina Project silo became the stage for Dr. Brenner's final act. It was here that his lifelong obsession with control and his complex, twisted relationship with 11 would reach its explosive and tragic climax. The final confrontation was not a battle of psychic powers, but a war of wills, a desperate struggle for the soul of his daughter. As 11 relived the repressed memory of the 1979 massacre, the Nina Project succeeded in its primary goal. Her powers returned, flooding back with the force of a broken dam. But the success came with a consequence Brenner had not anticipated: clarity. By confronting the truth of her past, 11 finally understood that she was not the monster in the Rainbow Room. She was the one who had stopped the monster. She saw Brenner not as a savior, but as the architect of all her pain, the man who had lied to her, manipulated her, and used her guilt as a chain for years. The climax began the moment she emerged from the tank, fully empowered and fully aware. She confronted him not as a frightened child, but as an equal. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. When she learned that her friends in Hawkins were in grave danger, she declared her intention to leave. Brenner refused. This was the final, critical moment of his hubris. After everything, he still believed he knew best. He argued she wasn't ready, that she was still too weak, and that he needed to control her, to guide her. He couldn't let go of his creation. He sedated her and fitted her with a shock collar, the ultimate symbol of his abusive control, reverting to the role of jailer. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Sullivan's military forces. They had tracked Owens and now stormed the silo, believing 11 to be a weapon that needed to be neutralized. The facility descended into chaos as Owens tried to get 11 out. Brenner, in a final desperate act, chose to protect her. He picked up her sedated body and made a run for the exit, carrying her out into the harsh Nevada sun. This act was the ultimate paradox of his character. Was it a moment of genuine paternal love, a final instinct to save his child? Or was it the act of a desperate scientist trying to save his most valuable experiment from being destroyed? The answer, likely, lies somewhere in between. As he stepped into the daylight, military snipers in a helicopter opened fire. Brenner's body was riddled with bullets. He collapsed to the ground, his life bleeding out onto the desert sand. The climax was not a grand psychic battle, but a hail of gunfire. He was brought down not by a monster from another dimension, but by the very human forces of fear and aggression he had tried to master his entire life. His final moments were a desperate plea for validation. As 11, now awake, stood over him, he removed the collar from her neck. He told her he was proud of her, that he had only ever wanted to protect her. He looked for forgiveness, for some acknowledgement of their bond. "I want you to understand," he whispered. "Understand that everything I did for you." 11, with tears in her eyes, gave him her final, honest answer. "Goodbye, Papa." She turned and walked away, leaving him to die alone in the desert. The final confrontation ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating rejection. He had been her creator, her captor, and her tormentor, but in the end, she refused to let him be her father. Dr. Brenner's death in the Nevada desert marked the end of a life dedicated to a terrible and singular vision. In his final moments, he likely saw his life's work as a catastrophic failure. Yet the true cost of his journey, whether it was a victory or a defeat, is a far more complicated question, one measured in the psychic scars left on a generation and the literal scars on the fabric of reality. Unraveling the true cost requires a grim accounting of his legacy. On one hand, his work could be framed as a perverse, accidental victory. His ruthless and unethical experiments, born from Cold War paranoia and scientific hubris, succeeded in creating the one person capable of defending the world from a threat of his own making. He unlocked Eleven's power, and that power, time and again, was the only thing that stood between Hawkins and total annihilation by the forces of the Upside Down. In a twisted, consequentialist view, the pain and suffering he inflicted could be argued as a necessary evil, the terrible price for forging a world-saving weapon. He saw a threat on the horizon, the potential for psychic warfare, and he built a defense. The tragedy is that the ultimate threat was one he unleashed himself in the process. This is where the staggering cost of that victory becomes clear. The price was paid in human lives and shattered minds. It was paid by Terry Ives, a mother robbed of her child and her sanity, left to endlessly rock in a catatonic state. It was paid by the other numbered children of the Rainbow Room, their lives cut short in a horrific massacre, their potential extinguished before it could ever truly flourish. It was paid by the countless scientists, guards, and townspeople of Hawkins who were consumed by the Demogorgon, the Demodogs, and the tendrils of the Upside Down. The most profound cost was the one paid by his two most significant children, 11 and Henry Creel. For 11, the cost was her childhood, her identity, and her innocence. Brenner raised her in a cage, filled her with trauma and guilt, and molded her into a weapon while calling it love. Her entire journey is a struggle to overcome the psychological damage he inflicted, to learn what it means to be human after being treated as an experiment. For Henry Creel, the cost was his humanity itself. Brenner saw a disturbed but powerful boy, and instead of seeking to understand or heal him, he sought only to control and exploit his power. By suppressing him with the Soteria chip and then using his DNA to create others, Brenner fueled Henry's misanthropic rage, turning a psychic prodigy into a nihilistic god of destruction. He didn't create Henry's evil, but he certainly cultivated it, gave it focus, and then accidentally gave it a kingdom to rule. Ultimately, the cost of Brenner's work was his own soul. He began as a scientist seeking to unlock potential, but he ended as a monster who saw children as variables and love as a tool for manipulation. His final plea to 11 for understanding was the cry of a man who, at the end of his life, realized he had sacrificed every shred of his own humanity for a goal that had turned to ash in his hands. His victory, if it can be called that, was to create a savior. His defeat was that he had to become a demon to do it, and in the process he created a far greater one. The world might have been saved by his work, but the cost was a litany of horrors that may never be fully repaid. The legacy of Dr. Martin Brenner is not written in scientific journals or military commendations. It is etched into the very soul of Hawkins, Indiana, a town that became the unwitting ground zero for his ambitions. His long-term impact is not a historical footnote, but the living, breathing foundation of the entire Stranger Things saga. Every monster, every hero, and every battle is a direct consequence of the choices he made decades ago in the sterile confines of his laboratory. His most immediate and powerful legacy is, of course, 11. She is the living embodiment of his work, a walking paradox of his cruelty and his success. The power that makes her a hero is the same power he cultivated through torture and manipulation. Her struggles with social interaction, her deep-seated trauma, and her fierce loyalty to her found family are all reactions to the isolation and psychological conditioning he subjected her to. She is fighting a war against the Upside Down, but she is also fighting an internal war against the ghost of Papa. Her journey to define herself outside of his shadow, to use her powers for love and protection rather than as a weapon, is the central pillar of the narrative. Without Brenner, there is no 11. Equally significant is his legacy in creating Vecna. By attempting to control and exploit Henry Creel, Brenner didn't just create an enemy, he created a dark messiah for an entire dimension. He is the father of both the story's greatest hero and its greatest villain. This duality is the engine of the entire conflict. The war between 11 and Vecna is a psychic family feud, a battle between two of Brenner's children, who represent opposing philosophies born from his influence. 11 represents the hope that power can be tempered by love and humanity, while Vecna represents the nihilistic rage that results when power is met only with control and suppression. The very existence of the Upside Down as a threat to Hawkins is Brenner's legacy. It was his obsession and his recklessness that led 11 to first contact the Demogorgon and tear open the gate. He turned a theoretical dimension into a clear and present danger. The red skies, the floating spores, the monstrous flora and fauna, all of it became intertwined with the fate of Hawkins because of him. He is the original sin of the story, the man who opened Pandora's box and then dedicated the rest of his life to trying to control the horrors that flew out. Beyond the supernatural, Brenner's impact is felt in the human characters. He is the source of the cynicism and determination that defines Jim Hopper, a man who saw the darkest capabilities of his own government. He is the reason for Joyce Byers' unshakable resolve, a mother who fought against a system that tried to tell her she was crazy. The entire Hawkins party, Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Will, were drawn into this conflict because their friend, 11, was a fugitive from Brenner's world. His actions set in motion the dominoes that would force these ordinary people to become extraordinary heroes. The long-term legacy of Dr. Brenner is one of profound and terrible creation. He did not seek to create monsters, but his obsession with creating a weapon powerful enough to stop them inadvertently birthed the most dangerous monster of all. His impact is a chilling reminder that the pursuit of power without empathy and science without morality inevitably leads to ruin. He is the ghost in the machine of Hawkins, the architect of its suffering and the inadvertent catalyst for its salvation. In the end, the story of Dr. Martin Brenner is a tragic paradox. He was a man who saw humanity as a system to be hacked, a code to be broken for the sake of its own protection. He dedicated his life to forging a psychic shield against the enemies of his nation, but in his cold, clinical pursuit, he failed to see that the greatest threats often come not from without, but from the darkness we cultivate within. He was Papa, a father who offered praise with one hand and pain with the other, a creator who loved his creation only for its utility. His journey took him from the heights of scientific discovery to a lonely death in the desert, rejected by the very child he saw as his magnum opus. But as the dust settles over his grave, one final haunting question remains. In his relentless quest to forge a weapon capable of defeating any monster, did Dr. Brenner fail to realize he had become the greatest monster of them all?